My name's Brian Topping, and I'm from North Shields in North Tyneside. In a mining area or an industrial area, uh, if you were a young person, under 30, well, you'd be like many people are now, into different music, different trends, football. You might occasionally go to one of the old-time social clubs. But it was quite varied. But at the same time, you had it against a background of growing unemployment. There was a divide in society, deliberately created, I think, where you had a lot of people making money, fast money, becoming rich quick, but they weren't too typical. The majority were on low wages and always the threat of unemployment. And throughout the 80s, we had mass unemployment. There were a lot more street corner pubs, town centre pubs. Now there are more venue or food-based pubs. There were more drinking pubs around in the 1980s than there are now. And they were a bit of a social hub as well, especially in smaller communities. But, having your local was fairly common then. It's not so common now. Well, I was too busy with politics to listen to much music, but I was a bit of a punk fan from the hangover from the 70s. My partner now, she was a goth at the time. So, there was different types of music. I was never much into what was popularly called New Romantics in the early 80s, but the electro pop in the 80s I quite liked. Live Aid and other things should be supported. And just as the big concept to free Nelson Mandela in South Africa, very important. But in 1985, the working class and the miners in particular were involved in a major struggle. And it was all very well to talk about Africa, and I'm not against that. I've had solidarity with people in Africa and support, very important. But we were involved in a major war. It was an easy one for some rich musicians to satisfy their conscience, in my view. Well, I'd had various jobs, but at the time of the strike starting, I'd become unemployed myself. I'd been a full-time political activist at the time. I'd been a lorry driver in the 70s. I was unemployed when the strike started, but I was a volunteer worker in a TUC, that's the Trade Union Congress Centre, when the strike started. And as soon as the strike was underway, I dedicated most of my time to that on a voluntary basis, largely. And it became a full-time job for a year. You have to, I suppose, put in context, we were based in the urban area in North Shields. The nearest colliery to where I was based was across the River Tyne in South Shields. But on the north bank of the Tyne and in Northumberland, there were still about three or four working collieries during the strike. But many of the miners who were working then didn't live near the colliery itself, near the pit. They lived in urban areas away from the pit. And we had many living resident in North Tyneside. And when the pit was working before the strike, they would be bussed to the colliery and bussed home again. That was fairly widespread throughout all the coal fields, because from the 60s, the 70s, the coal industry had shrunk so much that there were big super pits and people were bussed in. So when the strike started, people were then isolated largely from their workplace and couldn't easily get to the colliery, to the pit. So workers couldn't easily get to their place of work, the colliery, during the strike. The longer the strike went on, the harder it was to get to where the action and where the organisation was taking place. So we organised in the area they lived, and we formed our own what was called the North Tyneside Miners Support Group. We had weekly meetings, and we organised fundraising for miners and their families. And the local authority, the local council then helped us, and they organised feeding centres where meals were put on and where children could, the families of the miners could get support. And my job was to coordinate that. I became responsible for about, more or less 200 striking miners at the time. I was definitely passionate about it. I'd rather not been doing it because I'd rather the strike hadn't taken place. The strike created immense hardship amongst people and amongst the miners and their families. And the longer it went on, and eventually went for 12 months, the worse things got for them. So I couldn't really enjoy it. I did benefit and get a great education from being amongst the lads themselves and learning, and we all learnt lessons. Well, the union was essential to the strike. It gave leadership, it gave support. It was part of being a miner, was being a member of the National Union of Mine Workers, the NUM. So the NUM was very, very important. But historically, and before the strike and during the strike, there were different levels of organisation and preparation. And somewhere like Yorkshire, which was a very big coalfield at the time of the strike, were well organised. Northumberland and Durham less so, and they required much more solidarity. And because the coalfield was not as concentrated in certain areas, you had some fragmentation. But the union was a bedrock of the strike, and it was extremely important to the whole conduct of the strike. There were some areas which didn't agree with the tactics or didn't agree with the strike itself, and personally I can't support that. The miners' strike provides an example of sometimes what you have to do when those that have aims and ambitions which are completely opposed to your own and want to impose those on you by force. It remains an example of what you have to do, what can be done as well. It wasn't all a loss. People learnt lessons. The biggest lesson now, though, is to resist those that continue to want to divide, turning one against the other, whether it's turning miner against miner, worker against worker, worker against immigrants, or immigrants against us, or whatever it happens to be, or religious people against non-religious people. Those things are very hard to resist, very hard to resist. And sometimes you can understand people get hostile to others who are in a similar position to themselves. But the biggest lesson was to try and maintain unity at all costs, and we weren't able to. And we weren't able to establish wider unity with other workers, so we lost. For example, at Christmas 1984, trying to provide for the children of striking miners. I remember the French and Russian miners sent solidarity presents to Northumberland and Durham. And we had to try, and they were stored in a central area, and we had to try and get them. And quite often the police would try and stop that sort of activity. It wasn't just on picket lines. The police and the state tried to prevent a lot of our activity. So he didn't enjoy that sort of thing. And the police were specially recruited as well. There were police brought in from non-mining areas to police mining areas. Now, suffice it to say that the police, such as they were where they were in hotspots during the strike, but not even in hotspots, just locally sometimes, they were instructed to be obstructive and to be hostile. And sometimes they would even boast, try and provoke miners into violence. I don't have many good words to say about the police or those that were organising them. The miners were fighting on behalf not just of themselves, but of all people, working class people. It's a pity other trade unions at the time didn't join them. Some did, but not many. They did financially, but not many came on strike with them. Ultimately, it fractured the communities and left them, first of all, caught in materially with the effect of having been without work for a year, without income. So there's a lot of genuine poverty. What we understand by classic people just didn't have enough. You couldn't buy your children clothes, you couldn't go on outings, you couldn't do all kinds of things. And then when the collieries eventually closed shortly after the end of the strike, which the miners had always predicted and the government went ahead, it led to a lot of unemployment before people could find alternative employment. They had to be retrained and there wasn't all that many opportunities. So when the collieries closed, the mining communities themselves became, well, they were post-mine communities, weren't they? The miners themselves had no choice. They didn't want to strike. Nobody wants to go on strike and not have any income. You didn't get any benefit. Nobody was giving you any grant. You had nothing. And worse, because then the government and the state weren't prepared to give any help. The Tory government at the time, led by Mrs. Thatcher and her cronies, knew that the miners were a strong, organised force against the kind of society that they wanted to build. The Tories had a view of society which was where a few people were making lots of money, like as we referred to before, and others weren't. And it was at their expense. And they saw a way of consolidating what they were doing by attacking mining communities. Miners were well organised generally. The union was strong. Historically, they had been strong. They'd opposed the government before. They'd led to the general strike in 1926. So there was a tradition and a history there. The government decided to take them on, so they left the miners and the communities with no choice but to strike. It was the only weapon they had. And yes, I supported that. I still do. I still think it was the right decision. But in the end, we lost. I have no right to judge in one sense. But in another sense, like a member of the working class, I do, because the miners were fighting on behalf not just of themselves, but of all people, working class people. It's a pity other trade unions at the time didn't join them. Some did, but not many. They did financially, but not many came on strike with them. By the time it got well into approaching a year on strike, it was very, very difficult for some families. And when you've got pressure inside your family, your children are suffering, and you can see why people returned to work, but it was the wrong decision because they were letting down the people who stayed out. And miners have a strong tradition of unity. It's born out of the type of work that they do underground, the solidarity between people. And when you let your brother or your sister down, that's seen as many ways as traitorous, and that's why it led to people being called scabs, and why the wounds, in some cases, I know still haven't healed. It can split families, and that was again a crime of the Tories, that they split families. But some miners made the decision to retreat and go back to work. I can't support that. Thatcher called the miners during the strike the enemy within. She was the head of the enemy as far as we were concerned, as far as the communities were concerned, as far as the miners were concerned. And it wasn't a pussyfooting about, it wasn't a cold war, this was a hot war. With the state well organised and hostility and violence used against the miners. And that was supported and led by Margaret Thatcher. So I find it very hard, even on a human level, to have anything kind to say about Margaret Thatcher. I thought she was a disgrace to women leaders. She was the first woman Prime Minister there's been in Britain. But she was also typical of the Tories and the rich class that wanted to break the miners and break the mining community and subject working class people to how they wanted them to live, not how working class people wanted or needed or should live.